Austria has just sworn in a new government. The new chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, is officially the EU's youngest head of state, just 31. His party's new coalition partner, the Nationalist Freedom Party, or FPO, is the first far-right movement to get into power in Europe in more than a decade. These protesters in Vienna believe Kurz has struck a deal with the devil. Thousands of people turned out to reject the FPO's new place in government.
They are trying to use racism, especially racism against Muslims and against asylum seekers, to really destroy the welfare state.
There's little surprise that their newly gained power isn't going down well with many. The far-right party was founded by neo-Nazis shortly after the Second World War. Their current leadership, led by Heinz Christian Strache, says today's party has no connection to its Nazi past. Their critics are skeptical nonetheless. The coalition between Sebastian Kurz's People's Party and the FPO is in some ways a natural fit. Kurz has been steering his centrist People's Party to the right for some time. His recent campaign platform mirrored much of the same policies pushed by the Freedom Party, including getting tough on asylum seekers to combat what the FPO leader calls the Islamification of Europe, and demanding more independence from Brussels on a range of policy issues.
We stand by the European Union. We stand by Europe's plan for peace. We see one or other positions developing and different positions which we will naturally evaluate and also look for partners here and there. That is part of the democratic game and reality.
The FPO's rise to power has become a new source of anxiety across Europe. The last time the party came to power, in 2000, the EU slapped sanctions on Austria. A lot has changed since then. Largely spurred by the refugee crisis, right-wing parties have made gains across Europe. So we're not likely to see sanctions against Austria this time around. The nationalist FPO is also Eurosceptic, and it's long called for an end to more European integration. The threat the FPO poses to Austria's EU membership seems real. So much so that Austria's president wouldn't swear in the new government without a guarantee they would not call a Brexit-style referendum. While that concession has been secured, there's still the issue of European security. The FPO now controls almost all of Austria's security apparatus, including the interior and defense ministries. So it will play a major role in shaping how Austria participates in an evolving EU defense strategy. The FPO has a cooperation agreement with President Vladimir Putin's United Russia Party. That is already raising concerns about intelligence sharing among some of Austria's European partners. Austria's new coalition government has also rejected Turkey's ongoing bid for EU membership, creating renewed friction with a NATO ally that has played a key role in curbing Europe's migration crisis. The question now is how much Austria's new coalition will be able to steer Europe, and whether the direction it takes will be towards reform or disaster. Basil Rehan, The Newsmakers.
And to debate this, I'm joined from Vienna by Christoph Matznetter. He's the chairman of the Social Democratic Party. In London, we have Robert Oles. He's the director of the Bruges Group, an independent think tank. And in Berlin, Politico's chief Europe correspondent, Matthew Karnichnik. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. Christoph, let me begin with you. Why did Sebastian Kurz choose the far right and not you, not those who are left of center?
The story goes back to the year 2015. After the big wave of refugees coming through Austria, many of them in the direction of Germany, the opinion in the population has been more problematic than before in their acceptance of foreigners and aliens. And the Austrian People's Party, who was for long years our coalition partner here in the government, decided after then, especially Mr. Sebastian Kurz, to change the policy and to came nearby to the political positions of the Freedom Party of Austria, a right-wing party for a long time in an anti-foreigner campaigning structure. So in the election campaign of this year, both Sebastian Kurz, who is now since yesterday Chancellor of the Republic, and also Mr. Strache, who is now the Vice Chancellor, had the same, nearly the same positions in the election campaigns. It was against all foreigners in the country, especially foreigners with religion background, Islam background and many picking up the emotions also against the part of the population with Turkish migrant background.
Right. Okay, so Robert Olds, you have the party that was founded by former Nazis, and when you look at just one example, you have the new Interior Minister, Herbert Kickl, who's a former speechwriter to the Freedom Party's ex-leader, Jörg Haider, the author of slogans such as "More Courage for Viennese Blood," "Home instead of Islam," and so on. Should we all be worried?
Well, it's not the first time that the Freedom Party has found itself in government. They were invited back into government, originally into government in the year 2000, when Jörg Haider was still alive. And this caused a great deal of consternation throughout the European Union. But, Austria survived. Of course, we're now in a situation where, largely as a result of the migrant crisis and policies which have been conducted by other countries, namely Chancellor Merkel of Germany, Austria found itself with a massive influx of migrants, often passing through the country to get to Sweden or to Germany, and this created a great deal of alarm in, of course, Austria. So people were then in the situation where they went to the extremes. This is what happens if, indeed, policies are enacted that the population of a country are opposed to. That's not to endorse it, to endorse what has happened, or to endorse people in voting for the Freedom Party, but whilst the politicians have a cabal, we heard about how the centre-left and the centre-right would normally form a government, form a coalition. It doesn't really matter how people vote if indeed the same policies are enacted year on year, and if other countries in the European Union insist on a nation taking migrants, then people will resort to the extreme. And that's regrettable, but we need to understand that without...
Okay, cool. You're contextualizing it, and I'm grateful that you are. Matthew, I'm glad also that Robert brought up 17 years ago, because 17 years ago it happened. They were in government. The rest of Europe freaked out and froze them out, essentially. We haven't seen any sort of indication that the same might happen this time around. So what does it tell us about the difference between Europe of 2000 and Europe of 2017?
Well, I think it tells us a couple of things. First of all, it tells us that what happened in 2000 with these bilateral sanctions that were imposed by Austria's EU partners at the time didn't really work. There was a backlash against them in Austria. There was a rallying around the government at the time. So they didn't really have the intended effect. And I think a lot of people in Brussels, even though Brussels itself wasn't party to those sanctions, felt that it had weakened the case for the EU by making it look as though the rest of the EU was ganging up on this small country. So I think that's one reason that they didn't do it. But it's also worth remembering that at the time, the EU itself was much smaller. It didn't include the Eastern European countries, in particular Poland, Hungary, and so forth, which are at the center of a lot of scrutiny today and which have now similar governments to the one that we see in Austria. So I think the political spectrum in Europe in general certainly has moved to the right, and you just need to look, obviously, to France, to what's happened there with the Front National and so forth. But it's not primarily a Western European phenomenon, I'd say. It's at this stage still a Central and Eastern European one, and Austria is geographically right at the center of that. Although I would also note just briefly that the Freedom Party in Austria was doing quite well in the polls even before this refugee wave. They were consistently polling above 20%. Right. So even without this refugee push here, I think they would have done quite well, and they really are quite embedded in the political culture there.
Yeah, it's interesting. They are embedded in the political culture. Christoph, what would you say to those who might add that, listen, you have nothing to worry about because when they're in government, they gravitate towards the center and they become defanged. So some of the stuff that might be a little bit racist, might be a bit xenophobic, just sort of withers away once they actually have to govern. They become defanged. They're not going to grab and drag everybody else towards the far right.
Now, since 3 days, we have also the program of the new government. And if you look there in all the future activities against refugees, reducing the social support for people moving to Austria, you can see that as part of the policy to bring all these special regulations announced in the election campaign in reality. So we will see at the end of the day more regulation like the burqa ban, what was decided from the last government, also under the pressure of Mr. Kurz, who wanted this. So it will be complicated to have a policy which looks more for integration of the people. They are here. We have hundreds of thousands of people with migration background. And in reality, we need a policy to make the integration come through. So we need a population who lives with the people, interact with them, and live with them. And all these regulations to separate them. Even yesterday, there was the proposal from the Freedom Party side to make the housing policy, to change it and to bring them outside of the city of Vienna, like the model of Paris with their banlieues. These are all steps that makes more hate, brings more negative emotions between the actual population and the people who live there, many of them since years.
Okay, so that's an interesting point. Let me ask you, Robert. Let me add to that. The UN really worried. The rights chief at the UN saying this is a dangerous development in the political life of Europe. I am very worried, the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, told AFP. So keep that in mind. And then keep in mind what Christoph said. We just have a small sample of a few days. They already want to close the doors to immigration. They want migrants, refugees to hand over their cell phones and hand over their cash. They want to cancel Turkey's EU accession talks. So small sample of just a few days, and that's why people are worried. You would accept that they're not going to gravitate towards the center. They're going to push a far-right agenda, aren't they?
Well, it's interesting how this is described as a far-right agenda. When there's migration, there's always push and pull factors. Migration needs to be controlled. And whilst countries have these pull factors of welfare benefits, generous welfare benefits, then more people will just be encouraged to make crossings across often international boundaries, of course, and even across seas, dangerous journeys, using people smugglers, organised crime. We don't know who exactly is being let in. There's terrorism concerns as well in so many cases. So whilst these pull factors are not being addressed, there's a whole deal of problems that come with them. And countries addressing these pull factors, well, it seems to be very selective. Who is called out? Germany has taken measures to restrict access for migrants, benefits. They have to be resident for 4 years and contributing for 4 years before they're actually entitled to benefits. Denmark, we don't hear criticism of Angela Merkel for such a policy. She's not called out and called far-right.
So
Denmark has managed to restrict access to
so
migrants.
let's ask Matthew.
They're not called out.
Okay,
it
so
seems to be very, very selective.
Okay, it is.
And there seems to be an attempt here to try and isolate people that are considered beyond politically extreme. But then
you see there's a double standard. So let's work with that. Matthew, Robert sees that as a double standard. And might it be true that because of, for example, Germany's policies, that's why Austria has to do what it has to do? It might be unpalatable to Berlin and others, but Austria has to take care of itself because Germany has been leading the way with destructive migration policies.
Clearly, Austria is a sovereign nation and it has the right to do whatever it thinks is necessary here as long as it conforms with EU regulations and its international obligations. And I think that it's a good point that the Germans have also enacted measures that would allow them to read refugees' cell phones, for example, to download that data if there's some question about their actual identity and so forth. I think the problem, though, with using the word far right is that if you limit it to this issue of immigration, you might find that the Austrian position, this new government's position, is quite similar to what we've seen elsewhere in Europe, even in Western Europe, even in Germany. But if you look beyond that, there are certainly aspects of the Freedom Party. Its flirtation with anti-Semitism, for example, the language that it uses to describe foreigners, the way that it describes Islam and so forth, that I think that there's no question over the decades that this is a far-right party, and in my view is really the most successful far-right party that we've seen in Europe.
Christoph, if they set the wheels in motion for Austria to leave the European Union, would you be able to live with that?
No, I think this is not the question. One thing was clear, and it was also the position that our federal president, Mr. van der Bellen, who came before from the Greens, was clear. It will have only an Austrian government with a clear pro-EU position. So even the possibility to make an exit, so people's decision about the membership is not possible by the governmental program. So here I'm not afraid.
And please continue. Please continue.
The big problem is also that the storytelling about what's happened in Europe is more and more not on the facts there. For example, the new chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, talks every time that he was the person who closed the Balkan pass for the refugees. All people in Europe knows that in reality this was a common action of the Chancellor Angela Merkel from Germany and President Erdogan with this agreement to hold back the refugees in the Turkey side. But however, even in the election campaign, it was the big success of Mr. Kurz that he has closed this pass for the refugees. And you see in this story that a policy like done with Donald Trump to make new facts and to make his own history and his own story will be more and more. And we have seen this at the side of Mr. Orban in Hungary. This is a policy only looking for the votes in the internal campaigns and not respecting realities and international situations.
Robert, they're pushing fake news. That's why they're getting people to vote for them.
Well, saying that the first time, this is apparently the first time that politicians have claimed credit for things they haven't done. You know, this is breaking news. You know, it was ever thus in politics. Trust me. It's we're well aware people do not trust their politicians. That's perhaps one reason why they're turning to new parties and dare I say it, the extremes and various levels, because politicians often make promises and claim credit for things they don't actually control. But what we need to remember is the European Union. It has an external border. It's tried to stop migrants coming from Turkey to Greece. It deployed Frontex, its border agency, to control the border with Greece. On the Aegean. It's tried to stop people leaving Greece to get to Macedonia. What they don't like is internal borders within the European Union. Obviously, there's a need for these. And it doesn't like dissent. It doesn't like people like Viktor Orban or the Polish government saying, no, we will not take a quota of migrants. And these countries, these governments that are so-called anti-migrant, they do actually have the support, the massive support of their own population.
And that's a good point, certainly.
Restricting particularly Islamic immigration.
Certainly.
Now, people may say that's unpalatable. The European Union is playing with fire if they will force countries to take a quota of migrants when these countries have expressly said no.
Understood, and that's the tension between Brussels and sovereign states who want to reflect the will of their population. Matthew, let me ask you very finally, with what has happened in Austria, might there be a sort of contagion? Might we see the Le Pens and the Wilders of the continent revived and rejuvenated?
No, I don't think so necessarily. There's not any evidence really that the success of one right-wing movement in a European country has any tangible effect in another. And if you remember at the beginning of the year, there was a lot of fear that we would see Le Pen come to power, we would see Wilders come to power. And in fact, just a year ago now with the Austrian election, there was also concern that the Freedom Party candidate Hofer would win, and he didn't. So I think, you know, it really depends on the country. It depends on the political mood of the country. There was also concern going into this last election that the Freedom Party would win, would finish first, and they didn't. They actually finished third. It was a very close race. They're now in government, but they didn't actually win the election. But I think that there's no doubt that this question of migration remains the biggest political challenge facing Europe, and that this new government in Austria is going to put that country somewhat more into the camp of the Central and European countries, which, as Robert was saying, are really dead against taking in any refugees. Austria has been a country that has taken in more per capita than almost any other European country over the past few years. So I think this is going to remain a very, very contentious debate.
Yeah. Okay, gentlemen, I've got to move on, but it's been really good talking to all of you, Matthew Karnichnik, Robert Olds, and Christoph Matznetter. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers.